God and Science by John W. Dawley. Copyrighted by the John W. Dawley Trust. Narrated by Michael Drew. Chapter 8. Abraham. The 3,000 years. The dry land appears. We are now going to consider the 3,000 years of Bible history, the import of which corresponds to the real meaning of the third day of creation. And God said, Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear. This third day of creation we have epitomized as definiteness, and its consequent numeral of inspired thought as identity comes from the Latin word idem, meaning the same, and it seems to be the best term that one can use to describe that spiritual sense of things which is most clearly illustrated in the third day of creation and in the 3,000 years of Bible history. The fact becomes apparent at this stage that man is not separate from God, but is the same in substance and quality, although not in quantity. As a ray of light is not separate from the sun, just so man is not separate from God. The real man is not an isolated idea wandering vaguely through life, unaware whence he cometh or whither he goeth, but he is as definite as God himself, being the representative idea of the divine mind, God. One of the great features of this third period is the renaming of its outstanding figures. Abram is renamed or identified as Abraham, Sarai as Sarah, and Jacob as Israel. Moreover, for the first time, God himself is identified and named as I am that I am. At this stage, the Hebrews become known as the children of Israel and are gathered together as a nation. Canaan is identified as the promised land. Hebrew history was supposed to have begun at this time, and the record of Israel began to be definite and to be identified with the God of Israel. Even a casual survey of this period in the Bible, from Abraham to the entrance into the Promised Land, would at once establish the fact that it was indeed a time of spiritual certainty and definite formation of thought and purpose. The dry land was appearing. It was also a time when the trend of spiritual thought was wholly toward the awareness of man's close and sure relationship with God. It must be recognized at this point that whereas the symbolism used in the record of the first 2,000 years of Bible history was derived from myth or origin story, in the 3,000 years this definitely gave place to the use of legend and saga, believed to contain some degree of actual history. We are no longer considering the myth of the Adam man, which illustrates how the infinite intelligence operating through inspired thought exposes a false sense of creation, nor are we now considering the origin story of Noah, which illustrates the nature of God as infinite substance operating as purity of thought. The symbol has now become a more definite one from the historical point of view, based as it is on what is known as saga or folklore. Through this symbol, the development of the spiritual idea is now traced in strict accord with the tone and purpose of the third day of creation. The purpose of the prophets. As we have noted before, the prophetic writers of Israel were primarily interested in the discovery and recording of spiritual truth about God and man's relationship to God. They were interested secondarily in associating the Hebrew nation and its history with the discovery and development of fundamental truth. To illustrate the eternal facts of reality, they used any symbol or idiom that would seem to accomplish their purpose of revealing God to man. They drew symbols from nature, the heavenly system, nations, individuals, numbers, names, and so on, in the effort to convey to the Hebrews, and later to the world as a whole, the right idea of God and man. It must be fully appreciated, however, that these symbols were used to elucidate that most exact, ordered, sacred, and scientific revelation of the divine nature illustrated by the days of creation in the first chapter of Genesis. No matter what the symbol might be, the purpose of it was always to exemplify that basic divine process of revelation which all men might understand and demonstrate. It was no more possible for the inspired Hebrew writers to deviate from this seed plot of ordered revelation than it would be for the mathematician to deviate from the fundamental order of the numbers. It is true, of course, that the symbols to illustrate the ideas of infinity, although definite, are immeasurably more vast, purposeful, and far-flung in scope than the symbols of any human system could be. When regarded from a spiritual standpoint, the Bible is, in fact, the most important and truly scientific book in the world. Its minuteness of detail and at the same time the vastness of its statement are beyond any merely human comprehension. To understand the full purpose of the Scriptures, one must accept the basic fact of their teaching, that the spiritual is the only reality, and that the material is a finite and temporal sense which is doomed to pass away. This was the platform of the prophets, and it was even more firmly established by Christ Jesus and his disciples and apostles. Jesus taught and proved beyond a shadow of doubt the finite and temporal nature of the material or physical. He also proved conclusively the fact that an understanding of the real or spiritual always renders null and void the merely physical. He stated, specifically, that it is the Spirit that quickeneth, the flesh profiteth nothing. To understand the Bible and its teaching, humanity must therefore cease from considering man, whose breath is in his nostrils, for wherein is he to be accounted of? It must begin to consider intelligently the only real man and the only real universe, the spiritual. It must also accept the fact that nothing is truly fundamental, and therefore scientific, but the spiritual. From this viewpoint, one can understand and prove in manifold detail the science of the scriptural record. The symbols of the Abraham saga. The Abraham saga begins at Genesis 11, verse 29. Its purpose is to symbolize in detail the nature of the one divine identity and the consequent definiteness of all that is in accord with the divine nature and purpose. In this story, the chief symbol is Abraham himself, who illustrates the spiritual and scientific understanding of God's fatherhood and of the real man's definite identity with God as God's own idea. Next, there is the symbol of Lot, illustrating the human aspect of man's relationship to God and also a marked degree of sensuality. Thirdly, there is the symbol of Sarah, illustrating the necessity of keeping one's vision wedded to an ideal that is identified with God, and of letting that ideal bear fruit. As the story develops, other characters, such as Hagar, Ishmael, and Isaac, are introduced. But the purpose of the inspired writers throughout is to use this well-known saga to illustrate the appearing of the dry land of definite spiritual identity. Have we not frequently been to the theatre and seen many characters appearing on the stage for the purpose of illustrating some worthwhile idea? Just so, the great prophetic writers illustrated by this compound symbol, based partially on vague history, the understanding and operation of the divine rule, establishing man's eternal unity with God. Get thee out of thy country. The story begins with the statement that Terah, the father of Abraham, took Abraham and Lot, Abraham's nephew, and Sarah, Abraham's wife, and went forth from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. Thus the record names only 4 persons who left Ur for Haran. But shortly afterwards we read about Abraham's trained servants, born in his own house, so it is evident that many others must also have gone with them. Why then does the record only name 4? Remembering that the number 4 symbolized to the Hebrew writers the process of divine operation, the reader can draw his own conclusions. The author is not anxious to press upon thought too many individual instances of the use of numerical symbols, because he's convinced that the reader himself will shortly arrive at the conclusion that few of these statements in the Bible are haphazard, but that the inspired writers used definite numbers and other symbols specifically and according to the most comprehensive system, as has been indicated. The word terror means delay, and when examined in its context, this is seen to be exceedingly interesting. For the four who left Ur for the Chaldees only got as far as Haran, and then they seemed to delay for quite a time until Terah died. Immediately upon Terah's death, the end of delay, the magnitude and definite purpose of Abraham's mission reasserted themselves. This is made clear in that well-known and majestic first verse of chapter 12. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. Evidently, therefore, the progressive vision was Abraham's, and not Terah's. Does not this same call come constantly to each one of us? Get thee out of thy country. Leave the ruts and go forward. How many have suffered from that most terrible of human ruts, an exaggerated nationalism? How many lives have been warped and confined by remaining in family ruts that should have been left? How many of us have felt the call individually to come out from the merely mortal sense of life into the freedom of man's identity as God's image and likeness? If these spiritual narratives were not dynamic symbols for all time and for every occasion, they would be of little value to mankind. And if they did not illustrate the ideas of eternity and reality of the eternal now, they could neither be of God, the infinite, nor could they be essentially scientific. These symbols of the Bible, whether sentiments, objects, persons, nations, incidents, or numbers, are always illustrating some specific spiritual value which is ever available to men. Immediately Abraham had felt the eternal and divine urge to go forward, he obeyed. The writer of Hebrews states, For he looked for a city which hath foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Surely we must all seek the same city, a state of thought that has foundations, that we can rely upon, and that will never fail us. We can reach it, as Abraham did, through intelligent spiritual vision and progress, and through consequent obedience to divine law and order. This city is that which John describes in Revelation as the city foursquare, the divine infinite calculus of the Word, the Christ, Christianity, and science. And it is a city which hath foundations, as we certainly realize when we understand this calculus. Just as Abraham was a symbol of the definiteness of spiritual understanding, of that aspect of the divine nature illustrated in the third day of creation, so Lot, his nephew, was a symbol of the worldly sense of things, sometimes interesting and not wholly bad, but essentially undependable and sensual. It is very doubtful whether such individuals as Abraham and Lot ever existed, but the question is really of little moment, because what Abraham represents is our eternal ability to understand and prove the nature of every spiritual idea as forever definite and identified with God, whilst Lot is a symbol of the hopelessness and chaos of reasoning from a human basis and on a material plane of thought. Lot is that part of every human mentality which tends to lead to disaster. Abraham symbolizes the definite and scientific way of dealing with Lot, just as the specific fact that 5 plus 5 equals 10 is the scientific answer to the mistake that 5 plus 5 equals 15, and the only answer to it. The watchfulness and obedience of Abraham is well illustrated in chapter 12, verse 5. And Abraham took Sarah his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls they had gotten in Haran. And they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. Into the land of Canaan they came. There was no delay now. Terah had gone. Abraham realized, as each one of us must, that infinite good was ever available to him if he sought it in the right way, and allowed nothing to delay him. Abraham goes down into Egypt. The symbolic saga then represents Abraham as going down into Egypt, that is, into the darkness of paganism, through the fear of famine, and immediately falling into trouble through telling a lie as to his relationship to Sarah. The record states that he feared that the Egyptians would kill him in order to defile his wife, and so he said that she was only his sister. There are 3 versions of this story in the 3rd 1,000-year period. 2 versions concern Abraham and Sarah, and 1 concerns Isaac and Rebekah. It has no historical basis, and on the face of it is a most improbable story, especially as Sarah was by this time supposed to be quite an old woman. But we must remember that Sarah is used as a symbol to represent Abraham's ideal, that to which he had wedded his thought. Are we not all tempted, when adhering to our ideal might bring us into danger or unpopularity, to sidestep the issue and declare that our ideal is not really so vital to us, but that we are only slightly interested in it, that it is our sister? Oftentimes it occurs in human experience that we forsake the standards to which we would wed our affections and pretend to a less intimate relationship to those standards. Eventually, if we are in earnest, we have to return to them, but sometimes there is a temporary lapse. The record is that Abraham did not stay very long in Egypt. It must be remembered that to the Hebrew, Egypt meant everything that was materialistic and paganistic in thought. Egypt is frequently used throughout the Bible as a symbol of this. So many of us, when we've gained some sense of the reality of spiritual things, are tempted to go down into the darkness and materialism of Egypt for a while. But if our vision has been clear and definite, we cannot remain there for very long. And so it is recorded that Abraham returned to Bethel, the house of God, and there he called on the name of the Lord. Abraham and Lot separate. The effect of this renewed inspiration was that Abraham realized that he could not continue to dwell with Lot. The record says that there was strife between the herdsmen of Abraham's cattle and of Lot's cattle, their ideas of manhood. Abraham's state of consciousness was entirely different from Lot's worldliness and sensuality, and so Abraham proposed that they should part. How well we all know this parting in our own individual experience, and how unwilling we are sometimes to part with Lot and his sensuality, even when the time comes that we become aware of the danger of continuing to dwell together. Abraham offered Lot the choice of going either to the right or to the left, conscious of the fact that the issue was in God's hands and was therefore definite and safe. Verse 10 of chapter 13 explains exactly what influenced Lot's choice. And Lot lifted up his eyes, and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. He chose the plain, the flat, easy way. It was well watered, diluted, and it resembled the paganism and materiality of Egypt. So Lot chose to go that way, and it is recorded that he and Abraham separated themselves one from another. Abraham's vision of the days of creation enabled him to use the first day of intelligent thought to analyze his concept of existence and to start his journey Godward. It then enabled him to use the firmament of the second day, substantial understanding, to uncover that which would impede his spiritual journey, and thus to separate himself from Lot, and so he could begin to attain some sense of the dry land of the third day, definiteness and identity, for it is recorded that Abraham dwelled in the land of Canaan. Lot pitched his tent toward Sodom. The story of Sodom is evidently another saga. It attempts to explain, as did the myth of the flood, the destruction of all the people of the earth, except for the few chosen ones. Both these stories are really symbols of the inevitable destruction of all materiality, or, as the New Testament puts it, of every plant which the Father hath not planted. They also show the certainty and permanence of all that is born of God. Look from the place where thou art. Before we consider the Sodom saga, however, we must first ponder the great spiritual development which came to Abraham after he had parted from Lot. And the Lord said unto Abraham, after that Lot was separated from him, Lift up now thine eyes, and look from the place where thou art northward, and southward, and eastward, and westward. Genesis 15:4. Does not this indicate that after the separation from Lot, Abraham's vision could embrace a clearer sense of the divine calculus of the Word, the Christ, Christianity, and science, as illustrated by the 4 points of the compass? Look from the place where thou art, was the command to Abraham, and this is the command which is always coming to men. They must begin where they are, and let inspiration guide them into the ethics of true religion and the science of Christianity. In whatever state of thought we may believe ourselves to be, the divine calculus is ever present and ever operative. And each one of us can begin here and now to seek the divine and ordered revelation of the Word, to find the forever translation of the Christ, to use and prove the facts of true relationship in Christianity, and to realize that all this is possible because there is one universal science of being, available to every man under all circumstances. Moreover, Abraham was told, Arise, walk through the land in the length of it and the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee. This could hardly have been meant literally, for the following chapters show that Abraham remained settled for a long time in Mamre. Surely the land he was to inherit was the Christ idea, the intelligent understanding of reality, the promised land for each one of us, and, like Noah's Ark, it had length and breadth. For each one of us it has the line or inspired development of the Word of God, the days of creation in their unfolding order, and it also has breadth, the ever-appearing of the Christ idea to every plane of thought. All Abraham could inherit, and all any of us can truly inherit, is some measure of the city foursquare, built without hands, eternal in the heavens, the spiritual understanding and demonstration of the divine way of the Word of God, Christ, Christianity, and divine science. The availability of truth to men was symbolized in one way in this story of Abraham, and in another and quite different way when Jesus prayed that they may be one, even as we are one. And it may be symbolized today as an ever-operative spiritual science, but no matter what the symbol may be, the same theme is ever being expressed, namely the availability of spiritual and eternal reality. The Bible tells a timeless story, the old story of exact spiritual and scientific thought and idealism. This eternal spiritual consciousness is termed the mind of Christ, whereby one can always understand and prove reality. 5 kings versus 4 kings. Now follows the story of warfare between 5 kings and 4 kings, warfare in which Lot is taken prisoner. This 14th chapter of Genesis is regarded by the historians as the only definite piece of real history in this entire saga. But as a matter of fact, they have to resort to great ingenuity in their efforts to explain who the 4 kings and 5 kings were, and above all, to explain Melchizedek historically. In this chapter, the prophetic writer has used certain details, which may or may not be historical, to illustrate the warfare between the flesh and the devil, between the testimony of the 5 physical senses and the false fourfold calculus of materiality. Lot, the symbol of sensuality, was overwhelmed, but Abraham saved the situation, just as many of us have delivered ourselves or another from some sensual tendency when forced to face the issue in the fleshly warfare. Abraham's efforts to transform the Lot state of thought rather than see it destroyed are most marked, and indicate his certainty of the supremacy and rule of spiritual sense under all circumstances. After this warfare, Abraham was met by Melchizedek, a prototype of the Christ, and one who, according to the writer of Hebrews, was without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. Abraham was able to visualize spiritually and to understand to some extent the true estate of the real man, God's own likeness. It is recorded that Abraham accepted of Melchizedek bread and wine, symbols of truth and of inspiration, and rendered to him a tenth of all. That is, Abraham realized that only through an acknowledgement and understanding of the Christ could he apply his consecrated sense of truth to the human problem, as the 10 Commandments do in such an outstanding way. Consequently, when the king of Sodom offered him the goods of Sodom, he rejected them completely as not worth having. What a symbol of spiritual fact and attainment this saga is, and how infinite in detail and system, and what a mistake to attempt to reduce it to a mere unreliable piece of human history. Isaac, Abraham's promised seed. It's natural that after this experience, Abraham should realize that his vision of spiritual things would never fail to assert and prove itself, that it would bring forth abundantly, and that the fruit of this seed of spiritual understanding would be as the stars for number. Throughout the story, the multiplication of Abraham's seed is stressed, and he's given the promise that an heir will come out of his own bowels. In other words, allegiance to the ideal will bring forth fruit. It will be remembered that the third day of creation included 2 creative acts, the appearing of the dry land, called earth, and the bringing forth of grass, herb, and fruit tree. When spiritual understanding becomes a definite and tangible factor in our experience, it certainly brings forth fruit. The fruit of joy, satisfaction, comfort, security, progress, and so on. This was the fruit which Abraham was demanding. Moreover, he realized that his vision would make itself manifest in every detail of human experience, that its dominion would extend from the paganism of Egypt to the great river Euphrates, the symbol of truth and progress. See Genesis 15:18. But again, Abraham's trust in the spiritual seemed to lapse for a while, for he forsook his ideal, symbolized by Sarah, and took her bondwoman, Hagar, to wife. He used a human expedient, Hagar, to attain his end, and the outcome of this was Ishmael. This human expedient, as always, proved to be a source of conflict and pain. Eventually, through his ideal, Sarah, his spiritual sense was restored. The son of the bondwoman had to be cast out, and when Abraham was willing to give up Ishmael, the substitute for his real seed, born of his highest ideal, then his spiritual sense began to develop again. Had he not let Ishmael go, he could never have proved in some measure all that the wonderful third day of creation or revelation indicates. See Appendix 1, Third Day. That great Christian thinker, Paul, realized that the prophets were using incidents such as this in an allegorical way to symbolize the working of the spiritual idea, for he writes of this particular story, "For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was by promise. Which things are an allegory, for these are 2 covenants, the one from the Mount Sinai, which gendereth to bondage, which is Agar. For this Agar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all." Galatians 4:22 through 26. It is interesting to note that chapter 17, which portrays vividly Abraham's new covenant with God, starts with the statement that Abraham was 90 years old and 9, a multiple of 3, as a symbol of a definite sense of resurrected thought. Chapter 17 goes on to show how Abram, which means lofty father, realized that he was now to be called Abraham, which means father of a multitude. And this abundant fruitlessness was to come about in a purely spiritual way, and not through the lust of the flesh. hence the covenant of circumcision, which was made at this juncture. Funk and Wagnall's Standard Bible Dictionary describes the purport of the rite of circumcision as the casting off of the uncleanness of sin. This symbol was hereafter to be to the Hebrew a reminder of his pure consecration to and trust in the God of Israel as the Creator of all. The perfect order and sequence of this Abraham saga are most remarkable. Step by step, thought is led upward from one symbol to another, even to the pinnacle of man's definite and eternal identity with God, and to the fruit of his spiritual understanding of this divine fact. Naturally, in these symbolic representations of the ordered development of the right idea of God, the Hebrew writers introduced whatever they could gather of the indefinite history of their own people, just as later, in Isaiah's writings, for instance, the history of the enemies of Israel was used to illustrate the workings of evil. The point of vast importance to realize is that in all these stories, inspired religious thinkers and writers were illustrating the ordered operation of the divine system of metaphysics, which had been revealed to men through the ages, and the scriptural basis of which was recorded at the beginning of the Bible. They realized that this system of 7 days of creation, swelling into infinite numerals of inspired thought, all operating in a definite 4-dimensional calculus of the Word, the Christ, Christianity, and science, would enable men to attain an understanding of the ideas of reality, and so to correct the falsities of mortality. Just so, the 7 notes of music, operating in a calculus of tone, rhythm, melody, and harmony, enable a musician to compose a great opera or to correct the smallest discord in music. At the time that Abraham made his covenant with God, the token of which was the rite of circumcision, he became even more convinced that Sarah, the symbol of his ideal, would render to him an heir, and this through reliance on spiritual power. And God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. Genesis 17:19. Isaac, therefore, enters into the picture as a symbol of the perpetuity of God's eternal promise to man. The attainment of spiritual status through a definite understanding of God's true nature has within itself the seed of eternity. Consequently, the individual who begins to gain a definite understanding of God and of man's true relationship to him will be abundantly conscious, as Abraham was, of the fruit of this understanding, its permanence, and the fact that it is the eternal gift of God. Thus Abraham and Isaac both symbolize steps in the path of each one of us Godward, and so represent a measure of the eternal now, of reality. The divine facts of the days of creation, revealing God's true nature, if they are really understood and loved, never cease to develop in the thought and experience of the individual who is pressing on Godward. To take 2 human examples. Once one has learned to swim, one can always swim, and once one has learned to ride, one can always ride. How much more definite and continuous, then, must be the spiritual and mental impressions made on us by the true nature of God and man. Indeed, these impressions soon become to us living numerals of divine consciousness operating through the 4 processes of seeking God: the Word, finding God, the Christ, using God, Christianity, and being like God, science. It is evident that when a small boy has grasped the order of the numbers, he at once begins to use the calculus of mathematics in some degree, even if he only knows that 1 + 1 = 2. Just so, there can be glimpsed all through the spiritual record the developing sense of the 4 divine orders of reality, termed the Word, the Christ, Christianity, and science. The 3 men at Abraham's tent. Granted that the picture of a divine eternal system is a true one, then the course of humanity's history can and will be changed as a result of intelligent, spiritual and scientific thought and understanding, whereby the ideas of God in eternal being can be grasped and used here and now. For instance, a great proportion of the world's problems are problems of relationship, and men are trying to work them out, in most cases on a material and human basis. Consequently, there is endless conflict and only partial success. How could a man produce harmonies on the piano without understanding the science of music which governs the tones? Once in a while he might be successful, or occasionally one might find a musical genius, but there could be no certainty without a knowledge of musical theory. If men can understand the science of divine ideas, which governs all relationships, and it is the author's solid conviction that this can be found in the Bible, then think what tremendous strides can be made in human progress. Chapter 18 is a most inspired record of the appearing to Abraham of some measure of the highest form of relationship, the threefold or triune nature of the infinite as Father, Son, and Mother. At one time in history, God was considered only as Father. Then Jesus gave to men his unparalleled proof of the divine nature of the Son of God. Today, humanity is seeking and assessing at a very high value those divine qualities which indicate true motherhood and true womanhood. Consequently, the recognition of the motherhood of God is developing in our age, and will continue to develop until it is realized that God is indeed triune, for he is Father, Son, and Mother in himself. If God did not express in himself these three divine offices, the infinite would not be complete. If God were Father and Mother, whilst man were Son, then man would not be reflection, for he would have an original office, and therefore God would not be truly infinite. Consequently, at this point in the story of Abraham, it is related that there appeared at the door of Abraham's tent, at the door of his thought, a vision of three men of God, who revealed to him that his ideal, Sarah, would, in spite of every human impediment, render to him the proof of the eternity and identity of his vision. Abraham, indeed, realized in some measure the fact of which the Virgin Mary later perceived more fully, the fact that God in himself is the infinite Father, the infinite Mother, and the infinite Son. For he is the triune, and that the real man, the spiritual man, as God's likeness forever reflects these divine offices. If this were not true, then no one could ever glimpse for himself any idea worth having, nor could he conceive and bring it forth, nor could he establish it. The three men who appeared at Abraham's tent door were symbolic of his own exalted understanding of the one and only cause and effect as Father, Son, and Mother. This understanding was becoming dynamic in his experience, although at times Abraham's ideal, symbolized by his wife Sarah, seemed to waver in his thought. Hence the story of Sarah's laughter when she heard that she was to have a son. There are occasions when we all doubt the promises of the infinite good, when we cannot grasp the fact that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. The story of Sodom. As a result of his vision, Abraham could now see the hopelessness of the Lot state of thought, always attracted toward the physical and the sensual. So, like Noah, he began to foresee the inevitable destruction of this mental condition through inspired thought. Here there follows the story of Lot and the annihilation of the city of Sodom. The Clarendon Bible says of the Sodom incident, "With the group of Abraham's stories connected with Hebron, there has been interwoven a saga which was originally independent of the Abraham saga, the saga of Lot, and with this the Javist has interwoven an ancient Palestinian myth of the destruction of mankind." That this was the original implication of the story can be seen from Genesis 19:31, where Lot and his daughters are represented as being the sole survivors of the catastrophe, and not a man is left alive on the earth. The story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah suggests volcanic agency. Hence, there is a possibility that the story may have originated in an entirely different region and have been brought to Canaan before the entry of the Hebrews into the land. We have seen that a real situation underlies the deluge stories, although they could not have originated in Palestine. Similarly, the myth of the destruction of mankind by another agency, fire from heaven, may have a real situation behind it and have been adapted to another tradition, native to Canaan. In other words, a reminiscence of a disaster which befell certain cities in the Jordan plain. Lot's unwillingness to leave Sodom, and the inevitable end of Lot's wife, that is, of all to which he had wedded his sensual thinking, are a striking illustration of the struggle every one of us has in order to give up the lust of the flesh, and the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. When, however, we touch the hem of eternity and reality, the destruction of these things is inevitable, and the prophetic writers indicated this by the symbol of volcanic eruption, just as they had previously used the well-known symbol of the flood for the same purpose. Each one of us must eventually, through our spiritual understanding of God and man, face the mental conditions of Lot and Sodom. And although we may want to save the Lot that is within us, inevitably his end is certain, if we are in earnest. The truth we know will without fail force us to use what we have learned, and thus we shall intelligently analyze, expose, and destroy all that opposes spiritual progress. Thus, in the third day of definitiveness and identity, we shall be utilizing specifically what we've learnt from the first day of the creative faculty of intelligent thought, and from the second day of the understanding of the spiritual as the only pure substance. The symbol Lot goes from drifting sensuality and greed to burning lust and sodomy, and finally to incest. On the other hand, Abraham goes forward to a greater and more progressive sense of rendering to God the glory of all things, thus identifying him as the infinite and only. For Sarah conceived, and bare Abraham a son in his old age, and the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son that was born unto him, whom Sarah bare to him, Isaac. Genesis 21:2 and 3. Do not many of us in some measure have the wonderful experience of seeing the ideal to which we have wedded ourselves bring forth our highest and holiest hopes and desires? Paul writes, "I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness." This was his symbol, to express the fulfillment of some measure of his conscious identity with God. Abraham's symbol was Isaac. Abraham's temptation to sacrifice Isaac. Chapter 22 tells the well-known story of how Abraham was tempted to destroy the visible manifestation of his spiritual vision by sacrificing the human Isaac. It's thought by many authorities that the prophetic writers introduced this symbolic story with the purpose of putting an end to the hideous custom that prevailed of sacrificing the firstborn as an offering to God. Whether this is true, or whether the story symbolizes how Abraham was tempted by fanaticism, as we all are at times, to sacrifice unnecessarily the human symbol of his ideal, the fact remains that the story indicates in a marked degree man's eternal safety and the infinite provision made for his welfare when he understands some measure of his identity with God. All we ever have to sacrifice is the false mortal sense of God and man. The root ideas of reality which begin the Scriptures, and their constant operation in a calculus of exalted thought and idea, are no mere abstractions, but the most definite, specific, and truly scientific factors in all the world. Moreover, they are ever present and ever available to all who seek them, and eventually it will be recognized that all the good that has been accomplished for mankind has been but an echo of this divine system of inspired thought and idea. There is little more that is of vital significance in the symbol of Abraham. The form and perpetuity of the fruit of his spiritual ideal had been achieved after many struggles and lapses, because through them all, the clear shining vision of his definite identity with God had enforced the divine demand of the third day of creation. Let the dry land appear. In the Bible record, it is interesting to note how the different symbols, such as Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses, all come and go, but the development of the spiritual idea itself goes on eternally. Hence, the profound necessity of looking past the symbol of the spiritual fact it represents. A bride for Isaac. Abraham's son, Isaac, now comes into the forefront of the picture, but he is usually considered to be rather colourless as a symbolic figure. Indeed, some of the commentaries suggest that he is merely a link introduced by later editors to connect the Abraham saga with the Jacob saga. Even if this view is correct, it is evident that the inspired writers adapted this link so that it would illustrate the irresistible development of the divine idea in thought and the continuity of the divine purpose. The beautiful love story in which Abraham's faithful servant goes to seek a wife for Isaac and finds Rebekah is unusually supposed to be a symbol of the joining of tribes from Aramea with the Hebrews already in Canaan. But again, it is another pertinent illustration of the definiteness and identity of all divine purpose. When Sarah, the symbol of his ideal, had passed away, Abraham realized more than ever the necessity of protecting and developing the spiritual idea of which Isaac was now the symbol. Hence his specific request to his servant never to let Isaac return to the country which he himself had left. How often we make the mistake of returning to outworn conditions after we have glimpsed the promised land. Like Abraham, we should provide against such a happening by wedding our idea of truth to the highest and purest, to a Rebekah. Thus we wed it to that which is essentially virgin, and out of that wedding there will always come a Jacob. In the following chapters, we shall see in this third 1,000-year period how the finer essences of spiritual development are fulfilled in the experience of the Hebrew people, and through the symbols of Jacob, Joseph, Moses, and the Promised Land.